You know, the first half of the 19th century was just an absolutely explosive time for the United States. I mean, the country just blew up in size, its democratic ideals started to really stretch and grow, and its economy, well, it began to flex its muscles on the world stage. But here's the thing, these weren't just simple success stories, they were growing pains. And kind of weirdly, it seemed like every single step forward was actually pushing the young country one step closer to just tearing itself apart.
So that really gets us to the big question we're tackling here. How did this incredible period of growth, we're talking land, power, democracy, somehow plant the seeds for the nation's absolute bloodiest conflict? We're going to trace how the very things that made America bigger and, stronger also peeled back the layers on these deep and ultimately fatal contradictions right at its core.
All right, so let's start our story in the year 1800. This moment, it's a whole new chapter. Not just because there's a new president, but because for the first time you have power moving peacefully from one political party to its bitter rival. And for the time, that was truly revolutionary. It's right here that the great ideological fight for the soul of America really kicks off.
Okay, so this slide basically lays out two completely different blueprints for America's future. On one side, you've got the Federalists. They imagined a future with a powerful central government, a humming manufacturing economy, and strong ties to Great Britain. Then, on the other side, you have the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. They dreamed of a republic of small farmers with power kept close to home in the States. And look, these weren't just little policy squabbles. This was a battle over what America was even supposed to be.
So when Jefferson actually beat the sitting president, John Adams, people called it the Revolution of 1800. Why? Not because there was any fighting, but because it proved the whole American experiment could actually work. Power could change hands without chaos. In his first speech as president, Jefferson really tried to smooth things over, famously saying, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." But as we're about to see, that feeling of unity was going to get tested big time.
Almost right away, a huge constitutional showdown kicks off. See, the outgoing president, Adams, tried to pack the courts with Federalist judges at the last minute. When Jefferson's team took over, they just refused to deliver one of the appointments to a guy named Marbury. The whole mess ends up in the Supreme Court. And here, the Federalist Chief Justice, John Marshall, makes an absolutely brilliant play. He says, sure, Marbury deserves his job, but the law that would force us to give it to him is unconstitutional. And bam, just like that, he establishes judicial review, the power of the Supreme Court to kill a law. So the really crucial takeaway here is that in one move, Marshall massively beefed up the power of the federal government, the very thing Jefferson was elected to shrink.
This whole thing leads to a really fascinating question. How much did Jefferson actually stick to his own rules? He was all about a strict reading of the Constitution. If it's not written down in black and white, the government can't do it. But then, Napoleon offers to sell a chunk of land that would literally double the size of the United States. Jefferson snatched up the Louisiana Purchase, even though the Constitution said nothing about a president being able to buy foreign land. It was this massive power grab of a move, a very un-Jeffersonian thing for a Jeffersonian president to do.
So Jefferson's big land deal didn't just double the country's size, it threw open the floodgates for people to move west. And as Americans started pushing into these new territories, and as the economy began to change in big ways, that fragile national unity started to crack, revealing some deep divisions that had been hiding just under the surface. After the War of 1812, there was this huge wave of patriotism. The Federalist Party basically just faded away, which meant there was really only one major political party left. This time, under President James Monroe, got the nickname the Era of Good Feelings. And yeah, on the surface, it looked like everyone was on the same page, feeling super patriotic and unified.
But was it really an era of good feelings for everyone? Oh, not even close. You had a major economic depression, the Panic of 1819, that caused a ton of hardship. And even more seriously, that ticking time bomb of slavery was becoming impossible to ignore. Every single time a new territory wanted to become a state, the whole country just held its breath, asking, is it going to be a free state or a slave state?
And this right here shows you exactly why that question was so explosive. In 1819, the U.S. Senate was precariously balanced. 11 free states, 11 slave states. This meant neither side had the votes to pass laws that would hurt the other side. But then Missouri applied to become a state, a slave state, and that threatened to blow the whole delicate balance to pieces.
They managed to dodge the bullet with a clever, if temporary, political deal called the Missouri Compromise. Here's how it worked. To keep the balance, Missouri came in as a slave state, But at the same time, Maine was created from part of Massachusetts to come in as a free state. Even more important, though, they drew a line, the 36° 30 parallel, right across the rest of the Louisiana Territory. North of that line, slavery was banned, forever. It was a Band-Aid, for sure, but for the first time, a literal line was drawn across the map of America, separating freedom from slavery.
All those tensions that bubbled up during the Missouri debate would find their perfect embodiment in one man, Andrew Jackson. He was a war hero, a guy who called himself the champion of the common man, and he was a walking contradiction. He blew the doors open for democracy for some, but he also wielded presidential power like a king and enforced some truly brutal policies.
Jackson's rise to power happened because of a political earthquake. As you can see from this chart, states started getting rid of the rule that you had to own property to vote. This unleashed a huge wave of new voters, the so-called common man, and they saw Jackson, this rugged hero from the frontier, as one of them. They swept him into office in 1828, and just like that, the era of presidents from the old elite was over.
Pretty soon, Jackson's presidency faced a huge test. South Carolina was absolutely furious over a high federal tax. They called it the Tariff of Abominations. So, they declared the law was null and void inside their state. This was called nullification, this radical idea that a state could just ignore a federal law it didn't like. Jackson's response? It was swift and it was total. He said the Union had to be preserved, and he threatened to send the army down to South Carolina to make them pay the tax. It was a chilling preview of the exact states' rights arguments that would eventually lead to secession.
And Jackson's defiance wasn't just aimed at the states. When the Supreme Court, led by that same John Marshall, ruled that the state of Georgia had no right to Cherokee lands, Jackson reportedly just sneered, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." He completely ignored the highest court in the land and signed the Indian Removal Act. This led to the forced removal of thousands of Native Americans from their homes on the tragic Trail of Tears. It was a terrifying display of his view of presidential power. By the time we get to the 1840s, all of these political and social fights are getting supercharged by big economic changes. I mean, a whole series of technological revolutions were transforming the country. But here's the kicker, they weren't pulling it together. Nope, they were actually making the divisions between three very different regions, the North, the South, and the West, even deeper. This table really lays it out clearly. You had three sections on a collision course. The North was building this industrial powerhouse of factories and banks. The South was still this agricultural kingdom, where its entire society and all its wealth was built on slavery and King Cotton. And the West was the ever-expanding frontier of small farms. These weren't just different economies, they were becoming fundamentally different societies with interests that were now actively clashing with each other. And technology just poured gasoline on the fire. It really started with the cotton gin back in 1793, which made slavery more profitable than anyone could have imagined, digging the South in even deeper. Then, new canals and railroads started linking the industrial North with the farms of the West, creating this powerful economic bloc. And you know who this new network left out? The South. It just bypassed them, leaving them more economically and politically isolated. And as the South felt more and more like an outsider, its leaders clung even harder to states' rights, which just sharpened the whole conflict.
You know, maybe no one saw the danger more clearly than Thomas Jefferson himself. Years later, thinking back on the Missouri Compromise, he wrote these absolutely haunting words. He knew that drawing a line across the country based on slavery wasn't a solution. It was a warning. He called it a fire bell in the night, the knell of the Union. That's a funeral bell. He knew it was tolling for the very nation he'd helped create. The compromises of this era, they just bought a little bit of time, but they didn't solve a thing, and they left a nation standing right on the edge of a cliff.